Anybody?
Zoomers, if anybody there, could you tell me, can you see the Oak Room on the screen? Anybody? Yes. Sorry for the delay, everyone. We'll just try to get our Zoom fixed here. Just bear with us.
Just we can't share.
So Zoomers, we have a little issue with the Zoom. So you're going to see Nancy here in the Oak Room, and her slides are on the screen behind her. And that's what you'll see. But in the recordings, you'll see the whole presentation. Here, this. Tell me where, I don't, yep, I'm gonna sit. Yeah.
Can you all hear me in the back? All the way in the back. Great.
Okay, sorry for the delay. We'll get started. Zoomers, we're sorry we're having some trouble. We had you on the screen, but we're working with it, but we're going to proceed here. So Sheila Dickison is going to introduce our speaker for today for the Great Women in History. Thank you for coming. And if you have a cell phone, please silence it. Thank you. And mute, Zoomers, stay muted, please.
Good morning, everybody, on this very brisk morning, and welcome to the first session of Great Women in History. Nancy Dickson, I feel, almost needs no introduction at Okamic, since her arrival at Okamic with her husband, John in February 2023, she has been remarkably involved with the Residence Council, the Oak Leaf, ILR, and in many other activities. We've already benefited from her presentations on the power of myth, her series on Celtic mythology, on Arthurian legends, and several sessions on Hopi mythology, which she will continue in the summer semester with the rest of the Hopi series and add the Navajo. Nancy has taught at several colleges and universities and lectured for the Smithsonian, Johns Hopkins, and Rhodes Scholar. She was a non-traditional student who didn't graduate from anything until she got her BA after her children were born. She then dashed through an MA in urban planning and returned to the humanities for her PhD. So we look forward to hearing Nancy on Great Women in History.
Good morning. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here. Cave paintings, excuse me, which you see one of here, you should have seen a whole bunch of them before class. Excuse me, seems like an odd place to start a course on strong women in history. These paintings are from our great, 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 100 times great grandparents. They're found in caves throughout Europe and most of the world. They lay hidden for millennia. caves in, I'm sorry, I went too fast. The caves in what is now Europe depict handprints and a variety of animals that modern archaeologists believe to have been game animals. But because the paintings show what appear to be scenes of hunting, archaeologists made the assumption that the paintings were all done by men because men were the hunters. Today, that idea is being turned on its head by recent discoveries that most of the handprints on the same cave walls were made by women, and the only footprint preserved in one cave is that of a young girl running into the cave. I asked our guide whether she'd come out again, and he assured me she had. Now, these cave paintings may seem like an odd place to start a course called Strong Women in History. But please bear with me as I argue that the relatively few women who have been included in our history books are all great. Like Ginger Rogers, they had to equal or best everything a man could do to even be considered for a history book write-up. But until very, very recently, those who created our history systematically excluded women from their texts. Women were ignored, belittled, or even physically erased from the texts. In recent years, say the last half century, women have worked to be included in the records of our cultural past. And the response has been to pick a few women and focus on them. We all know their names. They've been drummed into us since elementary school. And to lump all the other women together as if their history was all the same. But women, like men, share differences of race, class, and education. In order to understand women in history, we need to go back to the tangible objects left by women, like the cave paintings, and then come up to the present time, thousands of years later, to examine the interpretations that modern scholars, historians, scientists, and archaeologists have given to these objects and to the women who made them. We can see this sort of twofold history in our own lives, compressed somewhat. We have the record of our lives and the things we've done, books we've written, bridges we've built, children we've raised, but the account, the formal record of these things is written by someone else. And unless we really make sure to write our obituary before we die, we're at the mercy of someone who is left behind. An example of this, a few years ago, Dr. Brill, a brilliant scientist, died. She'd been a prolific inventor of rockets and satellites, and thus was important enough to have her obituary in the New York Times. The New York Times obituary started, "She made a mean beef stroganoff, followed her husband from job to job, and took 8 years off to raise her children." They finally got around to listing her scientific accomplishments in the last paragraph of the obituary. Now, nobody, including the New York Times, would start an obituary for a male scientist as, well, he coached Little League for years, was a devoted husband and father. So we'll be using both the records women have left behind for us and what others, until recently mostly men, have written about them. History is not static. It's a story of the past composed in the present by a person living in a particular culture and often has a particular axe to grind. History, like myth, is the story we tell ourselves to tell us who we are. This story is based on written documents, oral accounts, artifacts, archeological discoveries, and other evidence of our collective past. But I will show you there is often a very wide gap between what women did and how later writers interpreted their accomplishments. Women have always been about 50% of the population, but depending on whose statistics you use, they only occupy between 0.05% and 33% of people in recorded history books. Clearly, something is wrong. The numbers just don't work. Even if we were to posit that women are boring and do nothing of interest, which I'm not ready to do, just having so many of us rolling around on Earth should be noteworthy. These disproportionate figures can be explained in 2 words. Everyone knows, or more authoritatively, common knowledge says. As we will see, common knowledge has shaped the histories we have read, the scientific conclusions we have drawn, and the view of male as the default, which has successfully kept most women out of history since the Greeks and others started writing it. Today, we have 2 streams of information about women in prehistory. One is the common knowledge that social roles are gender-based. Man, the hunter, and woman, the gatherer. The other stream is the increasing research led by mainly women who are finding, based on science, that early roles for these small groups of people were egalitarian. Now, in a small group, everyone has to be prepared to fulfill almost every role. But the research these women have done has been questioned and often ignored because everyone knows that men did the hunting, the hard work, and women took care of children and gathered the food they could find. Because we privilege written records, regard them as more authoritative, the group who got in first to write about the past could put their stamp on creating common knowledge out of the available evidence. This is how the powerful Scythian women became the mythic figures created solely to be killed or raped by the Greek warriors. A very common image from a Greek vase. One of the stories that I love is a Greek warrior has just finished spearing a woman to death, takes off her helmet, sees her face, and falls in love. Focusing for a moment on the North Atlantic coast of Europe, writing came with the advent of Christianity. So the historians in the British Isles were mostly Christian monks and scribes who were writing about their own prehistory with a Christian foundation, which led to conflict in their work. They were Christian, but they were also Irish or Welsh. They wanted to be true to both streams. They wanted to record an accurate version of their cultural past, but they were also bound by their Christian belief. This led to some very peculiar verbal acrobatics. One scribe gave a detailed account of a woman warrior queen named Maeve. But when she's bested in combat, he ends the stirring tale by saying, quote, "But this is what you can expect if you follow the misguided rump of a woman," end quote. Over the next 6 weeks, we will be widening our horizon to include not only women written documents about women in history, but also a variety of untangible records left to us by them. That should have been tangible, physical records left, sorry. In our pre-literate history, the earliest records we find are statues and cave paintings dating back 60,000 years. I don't know about you, but I have trouble getting my head around these numbers. Predating writing by tens of thousands of years. Although these records tell of women's activities and importance to the group, the interpretation of them by modern scholars tells a very different story. This first class will cover large swaths of time, and rather than give you large numbers as we move forward, I will use names for simplification. We have the prehistory, the first artifacts. Then we have history, the first written records, 61,000 years later. And then scholarly interpretation begins about 1700 Common Era to up to today. So really, our history comes in two pieces: the tangible objects like cave paintings, and then thousands of years later, the interpretation of those facts. Sorry, I seem to have some duplicate pages here. And rather than read them to you, I'm going to skip through until I find where. Okay, we begin this class with the cave paintings because they are the earliest record our ancestors have left to us. These images are sometimes hard to understand. We can say, yes, it's obviously a horse or a buffalo or a handprint, but why is it there? We'll probably never know precisely what the artist meant to say, but as a species, we're very curious. We want to know why and how, and above all, who. Absent any other information, we tend to use preconceived ideas to interpret the past. But these paintings do tell us what was important to them: food, hunting, and death. They also tell a variety of stories. This one, for example, depicts an animal-human encounter in which the animal clearly won. Another scene shows a woman carrying a bucket to a well. Some of these images are recognizable, but some of them are written in a language and a graphic that we can no longer understand. What are all those dots? I mean, yes, there's 6 squares off to the left, but why? And above all, the hands reaching out to us or someone from so very long ago. Now, creating these paintings took courage and determination. Our brave ancestors walked a mile or more into caves, possibly inhabited by lions or cave bears, with only rush torches to light their way. Unless you've been in a cave in total darkness with no sound, it's hard to imagine the terror it can produce. And if you think there might be a lion lurking around the corner, more terror. They had to carry everything they needed, their paints, their brushes, their pigments. We don't know why they did these or why they went so far back into the caves. Although recent scientific studies show that the air in the back of the caves reaches a point of very low oxygen and can produce hallucinogenic effects. We do know that it was crucially important to them to do these paintings because they and their descendants returned to the paintings again and again over thousands of years to revise and refresh these works. They were phenomenal artists. We see animals in motion with rounded bodies and realistic proportions. They are monumental and cover not just walls, but ceilings as well. They're huge. Here the horned animal curves around the ledge. You can see it right, sort of bottom center right. Now, in most of these caves, the access was so narrow that the modern people have lowered the floor. They've taken out tons of material so that we can walk upright into the caves and see what's going on. But for many of our ancestors, they had to stoop down, crawl along, and then lie on their back to paint. For some of the paintings, they could never see the entire expanse of painting. And yet, when we take a photograph today of the entire image, it's completely proportional, completely in line. Somehow they managed to do it. The hands, again, the hands just reach out to us. They accompany the animal images, saying, I was here, see me. This urge, this desire to be seen, this desire to make our mark on the world is one that we see today. Children cannot resist wet cement. Some adults can't resist it either. We want to make our mark on the world. Many adolescents cannot resist spray painting their gang's name on the side of railroad cars. Or in earlier days, carving their names in a tree trunk. And we see this urge reflected during World War II with the tag, I was here, Kilroy was here. These caves and their art stayed hidden from modern eyes until 1850, when the first cave was discovered. But the modern eyes that saw these ancient paintings could only see them from their own perspective and the context of their education. They believed that all of these paintings had been made by male Homo sapiens. But paintings in 3 caves in Spain were created more than 64,000 years ago, 20,000 years before Homo sapiens, modern humans, arrived in Europe. They were made by Neanderthals. But in modern texts, Neanderthals have been depicted as brutish beasts, as unlike modern humans as possible. But recent discoveries have shown that we coexisted with them, we married with them, had sex with them, we share DNA. How many of you have had your DNA tested? Do you have any Neanderthal blood? I do. He does. Anyway, even before the arrival of Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals developed what is called symbolic material culture. And that's a long phrase which means that they were able to conceptualize ideas that couldn't be depicted and then pass that down to their children and their children's children. This ability to collect and make a cohesive culture is one of the characteristics that only humans, according to scientists, have. You know, dogs can learn commands, but they don't pass it down to their children. Just as the archaeologists never even considered that the Neanderthals could create this art, women too were left out of the discussion about who had created these amazing works. Early archaeologists worked within their cultural prejudices to paint a false picture of the artists who created this early work. I'm not suggesting that they did this maliciously, but they did shape inaccurate pictures of our ancient relatives. I remember seeing a diorama at the Smithsonian Museum when I was a child. It showed an ancient Neanderthal family, the men striding around with clubs, and the women kneeling on the ground doing something impossible to discern or holding babies. Today, most of these ancient diorama have been removed, but the inaccurate images that they presented that were included in books for school children have influenced generations of children and adults who accepted what they saw as the natural relationship between women and men in prehistory. It's always been like that, see, right from the very get-go. Just as the early archaeologists were wrong to label the cave paintings as the work of Homo sapiens, they were also wrong to label these paintings as the work of male artists. Images of game animals and weapons had said men to them. And if early men were in the caves doing the important and dangerous work of painting the animals, they were probably doing the handprints as well. This attribution went up in smoke a few years ago when Dr. Snow, an archaeobiologist who had just finished a paper on the difference in finger length between men and women. As he was relaxing, he picked up a book with photos of the handprints in cave art and yelled, "Eureka!" Probably. Further research showed that finger length differences between men and women were even more pronounced in prehistory. Snow's analysis shows that 24 of the 32 hands, 75% were female. I love science and synchronicity, and when they come together, shazam. The earliest of the cave paintings date from over 60,000 years ago and continue for millennia, but almost as old are the small statues. You can see one on the left, and to give you a size idea, these are tiny. Throughout modern Europe, these have been found, for over 30,000 years, beginning about 40,000 BCE, people were making what modern archaeologists called Venus figures, even though it would be hard to imagine any female depiction that looked less like the Roman statues of Venus than these obese, handless, footless, virtually headless little statues. Paul Hérault found the first of these in the Vézère Valley in France, where many of the cave paintings are. He called the one he found the immodest Venus, and you can see the earlier modest Venus covering herself as best she can, and the other is 4 sides of the immodest Venus. Although this first discovery does not look anything like the ones, most of which have exaggerated breasts, genitalia, and many of them are visibly pregnant, but this slide gives you an idea of the range of the figures that we have. Monsieur Hérault seems to have believed this was the Stone Age ideal of beauty, and later archaeologists labeled them fertility goddesses. Although hundreds of such figurines have been discovered, their purpose has remained a mystery. They were carved from soft stone, bone, or ivory, or formed of clay and fired. The clay figures are among the oldest ceramics known to historians. The earliest of the Venus figures date to 35,000 years ago, and they continued to be made over 24,000 years. And I can't even imagine anything in our society continuing for 24,000 years. But these Paleolithic images of women continue to be among the most fertile sources of debate in all of archaeology, because few specialists have studied them firsthand. This seems astonishing. It would be like medical researchers saying today, yeah, there's a lot of animal to human flu transmission, but no one's studying it. A recent theory is that these figures began and have their greatest concentration during the last huge ice age, where temperatures plummeted, and it would be the last thing you'd expect to see is obesity, because if it's an ice age coming through, temperatures are plummeting, food's going to be scarce. But he and his fellow researchers offer an alternative explanation for the figurines' exaggerated physiques. The bodies are not swollen as symbols of sex, but as symbols of survival. The researchers analyzed dozens of the figurines, found they dated to this ice age, and realized that for every woman, there's a dangerous period which lasts from the beginning of pregnancy to childbirth and nursing, when she would need extra calories just to survive. This extra fat would have given a woman and her infant the resources she needed to ensure the survival of herself and her baby. The hypothesis is that there were so many of these figures because they were passed around as a cultural image to inspire more people to understand they needed, if they were female, of the right age for childbearing, to put on extra weight. It's like years ago when everywhere you looked, you saw images of Twiggy encouraging us all to be that big around. If you've got thousands of images of these obese women floating around, that's what people are going to want to be. And many of these are worn down as if they'd been passed around. Some of them have hooks that they could be hung around the neck, and they may have shepherded humanity through one of its bleakest climate challenges. The oldest undisputed example of a human being is the Venus of Holfels, the earliest known Venus figure. She's 2 inches tall. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I could carve anything that small with flint tools. She was discovered in Germany and has the large breasts, buttocks, and genitalia. Many of these figures are missing their head or have a hook so they could be worn as a pendant. But we do have a head missing its body. This is the only image of a human face that we have from this long ago era. And what looks like braids is probably, the archaeologists say, a net cap of some sort. The next one I'm going to show you is important because of the ideas it led to. This is the seated woman of Catalhoyuk, 8,000 years old, a baked clay figurine. When she was first discovered, archaeologists and feminists alike thought she depicted a fertile mother goddess in the process of giving birth. But a handful of scholars suggested that such figurines, found in great numbers in Catalhoyuk in Turkey, could represent elderly women who had risen to prominence and achieved special status in Catalhoyuk. She was also used to bolster the argument, first propounded in the 19th century, that Stone Age society was matriarchal, peaceful, spiritual, and sexually uninhibited. Sounds ideal, right? Women were respected for their life-giving powers, but when a Professor Hodder took over the site where she'd been found, his discoveries turned both of these arguments on their heads. His team dug through 18 levels of occupation, covering about 1,200 years of uninterrupted living. They found no evidence to support the claim that Catalhoyuk was a matriarchy or that female fertility was worshipped over and above that of phallic or animal spiritualism. But Hodder insists the question should never have been posed as an either-or question. We often default to either it's this or it's that, and sometimes it's both, sometimes it's neither. In this case, it was both. He argues that his team's discovery are so much more significant than anything previously imagined. Catalhoyuk was a place where true gender equality flourished. An examination of male and female skeletons shows that both sexes ate the same diet. Now, in most early settlements, we find that they don't have the same diet. They performed the same work. It wasn't men do one thing and women do something else. And the way they can tell what kind of work they did is the wear and tear on bones. You know, if you're a professional tennis player, there are certain bones that just get worn down. They didn't see any of that. And men and women alike spent the same amount of time outside. They inhabited the same physical space, and in death, they were given the same kind of burial. There's no evidence for either a patriarchal or matriarchal system. In Catalhoyuk, a woman's biology was not her destiny. Arrayed against this army of female statues and female artwork, we have one very impressive male statue. He's called the Lion Man of Holstenstadt. He was sculpted with great technical skill from mammoth ivory, which is not the easiest thing to work on. He's 40,000 years old, about 12 inches tall. He has the head of a cave lion with a partly human body and stands upright, perhaps on his tiptoes, legs apart and arms to the side of a slender cat-like body. The details of his face show him as attentive. He's watching and listening. It took over, using the tools that they had available, it would take over 400 hours to become the fabricator. But, poor guy, he's unique. No similar objects have been found, though there are a few androgynous figures from this period. The female statues discovered number well over 200. Our earliest records of humans and their near relationships with the Neanderthals show women taking an active and important role in social and religious endeavors. They were obviously important to society, since the predominant number of early three-dimensional representations of humans are female. But for well over 200 years, the predominantly male archaeologists and historians who studied and wrote about these early female representations misinterpreted them, distorting their role and function in the social structure. Generations of children were then taught these distortions, which became part of our cultural knowledge. Today, our cultural assumption is that unless otherwise specified, the default gender is male. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. I've been told that men takes in all people. But I also know that I cannot go into the restroom marked men. So that means either I'm not part of all people, or the rule that men means all people is a little wonky. Our modern rise from hominid ancestors to modern humans in modern textbooks shows only males advancing. In 1965, Life published an illustrated book entitled Early Man, which features charts entitled The March of Progress, which shows the evolution of the human species as modern man emerges. Images like this have influenced generations again and encourages us to see men as the norm and ignore that women were there too, often pregnant and carrying children. But she's always been seen as a deviation from the male norm pictured here. In short, women were not worth depicting unless as a caricature. These charts have been rightly criticized, not because women aren't in the picture, but because evolution has not been a straight line with one evolutionary stage leading to the next. While previous research has found that women may have rivaled men when it came to taking down big game, historically, scientists have dismissed female hunting prowess. But recent studies have increasingly shown women as hunters in part because they started thinking. That's the beginning. You start thinking about the way these people hunted, and they were much smaller than most of the game they were trying to take down. So what they did was to chase these beasts until the beast was exhausted, and then they could move in for the kill. Well, women are much better at long distance running than men are. Had the runner at marathon been a woman, she might not have dropped dead when she reached Athens. The remains of women, like men, have been discovered buried with hunting weapons, yet while researchers assume that these stone projectiles are hunting tools and mean the grave is that of a man, the hunter, they are not as convinced when the same sort of projectiles are found in what is obviously a woman's grave. And recent advances in how to determine sex from a skeleton have shown that many of these male skeletons belong to women. All it took was a little looking outside the box. Male as the default gender came into our culture in part with the Greek and Roman philosophers who argued that women were defective males. Seeing men as the human default is fundamental to the structure of our society today. It's an old habit and deeply ingrained. In the 4th century, Aristotle was already stating male is the norm as an unarguable fact. The first deviation from this norm is the offspring becomes female, although he did admit that that was a necessary thing to have happen for the survival of the species. In 1966, fairly recently, the University of Chicago held a symposium on primitive hunter-gatherer societies. It was called Man the Hunter. Over 75 social anthropologists from around the world came together to debate the importance of hunting to human evolution and development. The consensus was that it is crucial. One of the papers published in the resulting book claimed, quote, the biology, psychology, and customs that separate us humans from the apes, all of these we owe to hunters of time past. But, as feminists pointed out, this thesis poses somewhat of a problem for female evolution if, as the book made clear, hunting is the exclusive province of men, and our intellectual interests, emotions, and basic social life are all evolutionary results of hunting. What does that mean for female humanity? If human evolution is driven by men, are women even human? Until very recently, scholars saw women as deviant from the norm, complicated, less intelligent, weak, the list goes on. And that belief still survives. We see it today in little things. Here, let me help you with that, is usually a male to female expression. Ask children to draw a scientist or an engineer or a firefighter, even a chef taking a souffle out of the oven. And what you'll get is male figures wearing different uniforms. The view of women as deviant side branch has posed and continues to pose a dangerous threat to women. Just a few examples: medicines are tested on men, safety devices, seat belts are tested on larger male dummies. The list is long. Now, I can see some of you sitting there looking a little perplexed. What does all this have to do with women in history? This bias to male as default has led archaeologists and historians astray. One example of this bias leading to faulty scholarship can be seen in the examination of the skeleton known as the Burka woman. The town of Burka in Sweden had a grave which was excavated in 1889. They found a warrior lying in a wooden chamber in the black earth on the island of Burka, wearing garments of silk with silver thread decorations. Weapons crowded the grave, pointing to a life of conflict and readiness for battle. A sword, an axe, a knife, 2 lances, 2 shields, and 25 arrows rested beside the warrior. Elsewhere in the grave were gaming pieces belonging to be used, waiting to be used. Made of bone, they formed part of a naftal set, a medieval game of strategy used to prepare for war. A mare and a stallion lay at the warrior's feet. Shards of mirror were also found. Even though the skeleton appeared to have a female pelvis, the remains were labeled the Burka warrior, i.e. male. 70 years later, a team of scientists re-examined the skeleton using more advanced techniques that revealed that she was definitely female. But the team was criticized for not consulting outside experts and suggested that this scientific team had ignored details in their search for a female warrior. The following year, they expanded their original finding and searching to include evidence from other disciplinary areas that again supported the idea that this Viking woman had been buried as a warrior. But specialists and skeptics alike have continued to cast aspersions. Even worse, the largely female team of experts have received threats and online abuse. I'm going to save something for next week, but let me tell you a little bit about what's coming for next week. There's so much good stuff here. You're going to get it all next week. Boom. Sorry. I'm so excited about this topic that I find myself just gathering in all the interesting bits that I find, and not even all of them. Okay, remember earlier where I had duplicate pages? I now seem to be missing the last page. Okay, this extended look at our prehistory provides a context for the sessions to follow, allowing us to see why and how women in our history books appear as a fraction of the men represented. Some exceptional women already appear in our history books, and this is not meant to disparage them. But I think most of you could probably name on your fingers and toes all of the women you remember from history class, but you couldn't begin to do that for the men. This first class is meant to explain why many of the other exceptional women, like Enheduanna, sorry, I was going to show you a beautiful picture of her, but I seem to have gone all the way back to the beginning. Before Homer, before Sappho, people you've heard about, Enheduanna was a poet and priestess. She was the first woman, the first person whose poetry survives to this day. And she was the first person to name herself as I, Enheduanna, composed this poem. No problem with her ego. But we'll meet her and some other amazing women next week. Thank you all for coming, and I will entertain questions if you have any.
Nancy, thank you so much for doing such a persuasive job of asking us to look again at how physical remains particularly have been misread. I thought it really gave me pause for thought because I'm remembering a course that I taught at UF in the early 1970s, was the first course in my department of classics on women in antiquity. And I'm have to admit that there were quite a few misreadings presented in my class. So I would now, if I were teaching the course again, have to look at some of the sources that you suggested. So questions, I'll bring around the microphone.
These are comments, but not questions. I want to comment on the slide where you had 50% women, 50% men. Most infants who are men, many of them don't survive. So by age 1, you have many more women. And when you're looking at the warriors, if the men are the ones out hunting and fighting, they don't survive either. So by the time you're 20 or 30, there's many more women than men. That's comment number 1. But anyhow, depending upon the, what area you're talking about. The other comment is, it's hard to measure the wealth of motherhood, how important it is to raise children. You can spend 8 years raising children, like that obituary mentioned, and have the most wonderful children who go on to be wonderful adults who have their own children. Hundreds of years later, what she did as a mother may be much more important than what she did as a scientist, but we can't document it. It's not written up or anything. So I just wanted to say that in defense of motherhood.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
To what extent, if you've studied it, has the New Testament affected the role of women as perceived in society, where they're told to submit to men and be silent and all?
We'll be talking about the New Testament next week, and the Old Testament a little bit.
Okay, other comments or questions? Okay, we've got one up front here.
It seems to me that what the male caveman knew was that if he put his spear into an animal and it bled, it would die. But back in the cave, in his tribe, there were these people who would bleed every now and then, and they didn't die. Not only did they not die, but every now and then another person popped out of them. What a conundrum. What a mystery. And men have been trying to deal with that mystery ever since and have not done very well with it, I think.
Thank you for that. That's one of the things that I dropped out of my talk, that uh, men would see women bleeding, apparently with no ill effects. And when you have a group of women living closely together, they all start bleeding in sync with the phases of the moon and with each other. And here you've got this huge group of women bleeding and not suffering any perceivable ill effects. And men go, wow. And then all of a sudden they get these big bellies and there's a baby and wow. And I was reading a wonderful book called Off with Her Head, which is about aggression against women. And she talks about this same thing, saying that many of these men may have had uterus envy.
Okay, last chance for a comment or question.
And also, if there's anything you'd particularly like me to address, because this is a whole lot of time, a whole lot of information in a very short 6 weeks. So if there's something you're particularly curious about, shoot me an email, put a note in my cubby, grab me in the hall. I'm happy to give you what you'd like.
Thank you, Nancy, so much. We look forward to next week.
Nobody's looking at that. Oh,
Oh, really? I can't even see them.
well, Rick Gold had one that popped up.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, at the beginning, they spent a whole lot of time trying to get Zoom to work. And they finally had to, usually they have this as the whole screen.
Yeah, yeah.
And they kind of
Give up.
settled on this and gave up. Mhm.
Well,
Speak up a little bit. Okay. Yeah, this is the best. 50%. I'd heard it, thank God I'm not a woman. Same thing, just. Hi. Thank you. Oh. Put, put the pages back together. They're all out of sorts. It doesn't have the pictures, but I've got a copy of many, if not most of the slides at home. Maybe. I didn't mean to suggest that raising children wasn't important, but it's not, well, it's, if you've got somebody who made a career as a scientist, that should be mentioned along with anything else you want to throw in, but to leave it to the very end. Oh, and by the way, she put